Blessings, BookTube. I owe so much of who I am as a literature lover to this collection that they put together of Borges' works in the Modern Penguin Modern Classics series called Labyrinths. I think I'd read his early story collections, Ficciones, El Aleph, but at some point as a young man I got my hands on this collection, and it's some of the most well-known short stories. In the beginning you've got by Borges, you've got Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertius, the encyclopedic one. You got the Garden of Working Paths and the Lottery of Babylon. You've got Pierre Menard, author of Quixote, the Circular Ruins, and the Library of Babel, and the amazing Funes the Memorias. And then there's a bunch more stories throughout his career, including the Zahir, the amazing Zahir. But then they take up about 210 pages. And then the next 60 pages are essays by Borges. And they are essays of literary criticism. And then the last page is taken up by some parables written in his later life when Borges had lost his sight. Borges actually began as a poet, but definitely became most well known for the short stories. But thank goodness for his literary criticism essays, and in this collection. You already had his stories, which were so rich in intertextuality, right? They were already referring to all these other authors, stories, literary connections, ideas. In fact, in many ways, he owes more to the Neoplatonism of Joyce or Yeats, and Borges had English blood as well. But he owes, in many ways, more to that than Cervantes. But we'll look at that in a minute. Really, his influences range all of the earth and all of time, and perhaps beyond Earth. Who knows? I wouldn't put it past him. No, we don't know any aliens visited Borges. Let me not start that. Conspiracies are started so easily on the internet now. What I'm saying is, I'm reading these stories, and he's doing all this fun stuff with stories and talking about stories and talking about stories in the stories, and then he easily slides into the next section of essays that are non-fiction, talking about Valerie, Quixote, partial magic in the Quixote, the fearful spear of Pascal. So you've also got philosophy in here as well. Avatars of the Tortoise, Mirrors of Enigma, Bernard Shaw he looks at here. And the one The Wall of Books is another great one. A New Refutation of Time. We're going to look at his Argentine writer and tradition, which is from Discusiones in 1957. All the other essays come from Otras Inquisiciones in 1952. The parables from El Hacedor in 1960. So here we have a chance to... Anyway, so I understood from the beginning literary criticism to be like a genre. I read it the way people read mysteries or they read sci-fi. I just love it, and I think it's a creative act, and that's how I practice literary criticism, and that's why I do things like my pastiche series on this channel, and that's how I approached it in my academic years, and that's how I wish, frankly, more people would approach it, because it's a lot of fun. Here we have a chance, right? So you've got all these translated literature essays, or I don't know, reviews on BookTube, right? Trying to reduce every book by some author on their reading the world quest. So some poor author in Belize has to represent all of Belizean literature and all of Belizean society and culture in their book that might be about It might be a cookbook, you know. But we do get these great essays at the same time that are also fun, right? Like the Irish author, and these are fun to make these mega narratives. Um, and here we have a chance to apply one. So Borges' own Argentine writer and tradition to his own work. I mean, how often do you get that, right? So that's really great. So what does he have to say about Argentine writer tradition? Three things principally. The first is the difference between the gauchesque, I'm going to call it, gauchoesque if you prefer, poetry tradition. We're talking about the Trovas of Hidalgo all the way to Hernandez's Martin Fierro. Contrast that to the original payadores, the actual gauchos, who are like cowboys, you know. But think of it as somewhere between a cowboy in the Western sense and a gentleman knight, right? In a sort of more romance sense. So they have these noble, epic stories about loneliness and love and however, in the originals, which are in octosyllabic formats usually, they avoid colloquialisms. You know, they look to try to talk about the generic themes of the sea, the night, time, space, which you can see in one of in the end of the second part of Martin Fierro, the Payador with the El Negro. You know, he forgot for a minute to try to be fancy. But so what these Gauchesque writers, poets later on, are trying to do is they're trying to seek out obscure creolisms, and they're trying to reduce everything to Argentine botany, zoology, topography. And for Borges, that's a big difference, right? So you take something like the hendecasyllabic trovas of Hidalgo, right, that have more to do with like Garcilaso's, you know, bringing over from Italian poetry into the Spanish than they do with the original payadores, the original cowboy chants, right, in the saddle. They have a certain rhythm of the saddle, right? So that's a big thing for him, right? So there's a big difference between these poets, these troubadours, who are doing beautiful, wonderful, great art, but it's not the same as the original. You know what Borges knew from the suburbs, and it was just the end of the era of the cuchillo, of the dagger, in the suburbs of Buenos Aires, where he could still catch these old men telling these old chants. Right, so that's a big one, very important. Anything more that I need to say about this? He cites like a poem like La Urna by Ricardo Banch, maybe, that talks about, you know, this beautiful poem with the slanting roofs and the nightingale. And he says that people critiqued it because Buenos Aires doesn't have these slanting roofs, and the nightingale is a very, you know, Greek evocation. But he says it doesn't matter because La Urna, the poem, has that Argentine reserve, distrust, reticence, constraint. So he feels that, you know, it still nonetheless conveys this Argentineness without needing to worry about getting the roofs right, if you catch my meaning. Right, I think that's probably everything to say about that. We'll see it in our story that we're going to look at, Death in the Compass, where Triste-le-Roi is the name, Rue de Toulon are the names of the places in this unnamed city, but they really can be graphed right onto the map of Buenos Aires, right onto Paseo Colón and Arbroge House, and it's easily it easily maps onto Buenos Aires. Um, you have in Don Segundo Sobra, or say by Guiraldes, um, these influences from like everything from like Kipling's Kim, Huck Finn, these Montmartrian metaphors. So so that would be an example of the Gauchesque poetry drawing on other things than the Argentine. As well, Borges would say it should. In fact, Payadores, the poem Payadores, who wrote that one, is almost a burlesque of Gaucho poetry. Okay, so the second thing is the Spanish tradition, right? Of course. At this time that he's writing, some people are trying to say that Argentina. What Borges says is that Argentina is a young country. Let me find the actual quote for you. He says, look, Argentina is a young country, a new country. Precisely because is it a new country, we have a great sense of time. Everything that has taken place in Europe, the dramatic happenings of the last years in Europe, have had profound resonance here. So, contrary to the movement at the time that Borges is writing this, when the Argentine writers are trying to like divorce themselves from Spain and history, Borges would argue that no, it's all very much connected. The introduction to this work has by James E. Irby has an interesting quote about Cervantes, which I said there's no easy equivalence between Cervantes and Borges. Don't get it wrong. In fact, he says so here. Cervantes, so apparently unlike Borges, but whose name is not invoked in vain in his stories, essays, and parables. Borges' fictions, like the enormous fiction of Don Quixote, grows out of the deep confrontation of literature and life, which is not only the central problem of all literature, but also that of all human experience, the problem of illusion and reality. Another quote from Borges says, really the central thesis of all of this, I would say, is that besides, I do not know if it is necessary to say that the idea that a literature must define itself in terms of its national traits is a relatively new concept. Also new and arbitrary is the idea that writers must seek themes from their own countries. Without going any further, I think Racine would not have understood a person who denied him the right to the title of Poet of France because he cultivated Greek and Roman themes. And he goes on to talk about Shakespeare's use of the Scandinavian, right? The Scottish. So great world writers don't worry where they pick their fruits, right? They like all exotic fruits. So this is not just with regards to Spain, but also to the case of Argentine relationship, both with itself, its history, and European Western literature in general. So I mentioned some various influences on some different Argentine authors. Borges drew on, oh my gosh, a huge array of literature. He's often called Kafkaesque, although I don't jive too much with that one. But who else is he often compared to? Valéry, certainly. The French writer Valéry. Poe, Chesterton. He did love Father Brown. He thought Father Brown combined the detective fiction with and we'll see that in our story that we're about to look at now, which is The Death in the Compass. He thought Father Brown combined the detective fiction, interestingly, with the theology, and you will see that Borges has a deep interest in theology, and especially in Judaism. Swift is another one he's compared to quite a bit. Erewhon. Who else? Okay, we're just flipping through here. Mallarmé, Baudelaire, even Flaubert, Saint Jean for his imperfects, use of imperfects, and the lack of adjectives. He's comparable to Saint John's purse. All right, so there we go. I think that's enough to be going on with for the introductory bit, which is the Argentine tradition. Now let's apply that, Borges' own depiction of the Argentine tradition. Let's apply that now to his story, Death of the Compass. Actually, I had a hard time choosing which story I wanted to compare him with, because there were so many, and I couldn't decide whether to pick one that was more cosmopolitan or more quote-unquote Argentine. In the end, I went with one that had it with a strong genre story that I thought that's kind of crosses borders, right? So you got your detective fiction jumping from Poe, right, to Mallarmé, to Maigret, to all the detectives across literature. Sherlock Holmes. Right, so the last thing I'll say from the Argentine tradition is the last sentence of the work, which says that, to sum it all up, for that reason I repeat that we should not be alarmed, that we should feel that our patronymy is the universe. We should essay all themes, and we cannot limit ourselves to purely Argentine subjects in order to be Argentine. For either being Argentine is an inescapable act of fate, and in that case we shall be so in all events, or being Argentine is a mere affectation, a mask. And he says, I believe that if we surrender ourselves to the voluntary dream that is artistic creation, we shall be Argentine, and we shall be good or tolerable writers. So let's see if he does that. Let's see if we can identify some of those three aspects in our story, which is Death in the Compass. So the first death occurs on 3/12, so December 12th. The next on January 3rd, and then the last on February 3rd. And next to the victim is written the name, the first letter of the name has been uttered next to the first victim, who is a Talmudic scholar, Dr. Marcel Yarmolinsk, in the Hotel du Nord. He's there for a conference on the Tetrarch of Galilee, I think, something like that. The third Talmudic Compass. And he's the delegate from Podolsk. So there we have the cosmopolitan already. By the way, the name of the investigator, who's not the policeman, is Lohnrot, with an umlaut, and that's in the second line of the story. So we already start off with some pretty exotic names, exotic to Argentina. Although for those who aren't familiar with Argentina, you should know it's very much Spanish names, but a lot of Italian names. You can just look at their football team in the World Cup. Argentina is one of the more European countries, so they have a lot of European names. In fact, I met a fellow there whose football league, his little sort of local soccer teams, you had to have a German name to participate. I won't say any more than that. Okay. So Lohnrot believed himself a pure reasoner, an Auguste Dupin, but there was something of the adventure in him, and even a little of the gambler. And then he's going to be his sort of policeman that he's working with is a sort of no-nonsense fellow, name of, let's see, what's his name? I'll tell you when I come to it later. But anyway, he's not having all this intellectual investigations that Lönnrot's all into. So Lönnrot immediately, due to this writing, the first letter of the name has been written. He immediately seizes on this murder being connected to somehow to the conference, to the the ideas of Judaism and these writings. So he gets all of the books, takes the books, he's reading the books, investigating the books. He calls on the Yiddish Zeitung editor and asks him about stuff. By the way, it's said from the very beginning the first murder occurred in the Hotel du Nord. So that sort of really already tips the scales, doesn't it, that there's going to be another murder. So that's something interesting in terms of it's not presented historically in terms of a murder happened, then we don't know that a second one's going to happen. Just the way people call World War I, when of course at the time it was not known as World War I. Right, so the second murder is a guy. Is he the guy in the room above the pub? No, that's the third murdered guy. The second one is, let's find him. Oh, yeah, there's the inspector's name. Treviranus. That's right, Treviranus. A-N-U-S is how it ends. Trevere, I don't know what that gives in Latin. That's his name, so I won't say any more than that. No need to look for a three-legged cat here, Treviranus says. So there's his gruff demeanor, right? He's not looking for overly complicated explanations involving vindication of the Kabbalah, an examination of the philosophy of Robert Flood, Zephyr Yazira, a biography of the Baal Shalem, history of the Hasidic sect, a monograph in German on the Tetragrammaton, etc., etc. He's all about Occam's razor, but he wouldn't probably know that that's something you don't shave with. Okay, so oh yes, I was finding you the second murder. So the second murderer is this fellow. But is he the second murderer? What was the actual order of the murders? Keep that in mind. And also always the possibility of a copycat. I'm not going to spoil this by the way, but I will tell you one thing that I figured out, which might unravel it all for you, but might not. So I think it's a fair observation. So the second guy killed, he's Daniel Simon Azevedo, some fame in the northern suburbs. He started as a wagon driver, became a political tough, degenerated to a thief, and eventually an informer. So that's the second guy killed. And then the third guy is this mysterious guy in a room above a pub, who these guys come and pick him up and take him out. Is he drunk and happy to go out with them, or is he drugged and kidnapped? Not entirely clear. So after Azevedo, the second letter of the name has been uttered, is written on some tiles. It's significant where each of the things is written and how it's written as well. And in the third case, it's written, the last of the name has been uttered. So the last of the names, the last of the letters of the name has been uttered. So the Inspector Anus drops the case, right? Because the last of the name. I mean, he hasn't solved it, but he doesn't expect any more murders. However, Lönnrot is convinced that there will be a fourth murder. And I also, because of the Jewish connection, and I didn't even necessarily mean the Tetragrammaton, but if you know the Tetragrammaton, is it 2 letters? Is it 4? Is it 3 letters? Is it 4 letters? You know, the name of the deity, which Jews may not speak. But the more important aspect is that I got right away from the dates. I'm like, why these dates are so important? And they make a big deal at a certain point of explaining that when the Jewish day begins in the nighttime, etc., which means that each of these murders occurs on the 4th. So what does our Inspector Lönnrot do? He tries to anticipate the 4th murder, because he looks on a map and he thinks he maps it out and knows where it's going to take place, and he goes there to stop it. And I won't tell you anymore what happened, but there you have it. So let's see how we did in terms of Borges' idea of Argentine tradition. Well, the first would be something to do with the Gauchoesque. So at one point he does make a mention, with regards to the second victim, Azevedo. Azevedo was the last representative of a generation of bandits who know how to manipulate a dagger, but not a revolver. The words in chalk were the following: the second letter of the name has been uttered. So right before the inscription, we have this evocation of this time of change in Argentina from the old honor of the knife, which also is related to a lot of things. To oversimplify, it could be related to something like the Italian tradition of not vigilance. What's it called? Vindictive. Not vindictive. Vendetta. Yeah, a vendetta. So things like that. So ways you have to fight with your knife to avenge your honor, or upname the honor of your name, things of that nature. It's just a code as complicated as the Bushido, as complicated as chivalresque codes of the Middle Ages in Europe. So that age of that code is ending, and it's ending with the death of this informer. So very important, I think. So that, I think, is an interesting observation with regards to the first aspect of the Gauchoesque. Now let's see if we can find anything in here really with reference to the Spanish tradition. Of course, you have the Andalus tradition, which is the Judaism that was more than tolerated in the south of Spain prior to the Reconquista, under the Islamic Andalus era, in Barcelona and all those places. You had these great Maimonides, wasn't he Jewish? You had these great Jewish thinkers who brought for us and preserved for us and brought back to us, and in some way took it all over Europe when they were kicked out of Spain. Not just the literal translation of the Bible, the Hebrew, but also all the old Greek and Roman philosophy and ideas that had been really lost to the West, but preserved in the East, and then came in with Islam and the Jews in the south of Spain. So I think that's really all that's happening Spain-wise here, would really be in the Talmudic conference. So sort of cosmopolitan Spain, if you will, which is appropriate because the whole theme here is cosmopolitan. And the third would be the Argentina, open to the world, open to new ideas. And I think you have that also with this conference being given. And even the third victim, he's above the bar. This guy Finnegan in Liverpool House is the name of the bar. It's a very sort of Irish thing going there. And then the people who take him out are, let me find that. Oh, they're dressed up because it's carnival time, so you got that as well. They're dressed as cats. I mean, it's almost like Murder and Margarita, Master and Margarita. These guys who kidnap him, or maybe not, they're just all dressed up in various costumes, very cosmopolitan. The guy up in the rented room gave his name as Ginsburg, possibly Ginsberg with a S, but we think that his name is actually Gryphius. So you've got this Gryphius, Ginsberg, name confusion. The way the afternoon papers talk about these murders is also interesting. You have a range of political spectrum in these newspapers. So, and by the way, it's not said that this is in Buenos Aires, but it's almost as soon as you have the reference to the knives, to the dagger tradition there, which really locates it more in Buenos Aires than Spain. You have the evocation of this character who's like a thug from Barcelona. So then you're like, well, no, now are you throwing it back to Spain again? But then these newspapers, I bet if you had the historical knowledge to trace these titles of these newspapers are probably misgiven. You could identify which Buenos Aires newspapers historically they were at that era and what their where they were on the political spectrum. So Cruz de la Espada, so cross of the sword, excuse me, praised the murders for their admirable discipline and the order of the Lasker Medical Congress. Meanwhile, in El Martir, the Martyr, they criticized the intolerable delays in the clandestine and frugal pogrom, which has taken 3 months to murder 3 Jews. So obviously anti-Semitic, one would imagine quite right-wing. The Yiddish Zeitung, which the mere fact that it exists, it shows a certain tolerance to at least European Judaism, rejected the horrible hypothesis of an anti-Semitic plot, even though many penetrating intellects admit no other solution to the triple mystery. And the most illustrious gunman of the South, Dandy Red Sherlock, is quoted as swearing that in his district, similar crimes could never occur. So apparently one of the forces of law and order, or corrupt barrow politician in this city is named Dandy Red Sherlock. So I think it's about as cosmopolitan as you could get, and I think that his story very much represents his vision of Argentine literature. It's not the only version of Argentine literature. Let's keep that in mind when we read these books. They are just one window onto the nations and cultures that we're asking them to inform us about. They shouldn't be taken for the whole enchilada. Although it's an admirable start, I do recommend that you do read one book from each culture. Don't get me wrong, but hopefully eventually go on to read more than just that one book. And just be a little careful with our generalizations. So I hope you've enjoyed my look at Jorge Luis Borges' Labyrinths. Each of the stories in here is amazing. If you've never read much literary criticism, these aren't the easiest literary critical essays to read. They're pretty dense with allusions, a lot of literature from all over the world and different historical eras. But don't let that put you off. Persevere. I think you'll find that literary criticism is a very fun genre indeed to read. And this will also give you the fables at the end as a sort of like reward, a little dessert. And those are super short and super easy and also a lot of fun. So there you have it. Jorge Luis Borges, Labyrinths. Check it out.